Welcome to Living Well with MS. This podcast comes to you from Overcoming MS, the world's leading multiple sclerosis healthy lifestyle charity, which helps people live a full and healthy life through the Overcoming MS program. We interview a range of experts and people with multiple sclerosis. Please remember, all opinions expressed are their own. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review. These are quick to do and really help us. And now here's your host, Jeff Alex.
Joining us on this edition of the OMS Coffee Break is Renee Coffey. Renee is a contributor to the OMS Handbook and is in the chapter first months after MS diagnosis with her story. So, welcome Renee to the Coffee Break.
Hi Jeff, really great to be here.
So to start off with, could you tell us about your first MS symptoms and the diagnosis process? How did that go?
Yeah, absolutely. So I first started experiencing symptoms in 2011. I was 29 years old and I'd just moved down to Sydney to take up a promotion with my employer. And I started to experience some itching across my torso on one side, and it just wasn't resolving. And I ended up going to the GP, and initially they gave me some kind of cream, antihistamine type creams to put on it, and the itching didn't stop. And so I went back again, and I think fairly quickly the GP recognized that something neurological was going on, which I am to this day incredibly thankful for, because I know so many people spend a very long time before they get a diagnosis with very strange symptoms.
Yeah, especially something where you've got it, because there must be countless people where it's not MS. And
exactly.
Actually it is just a skin complaint, or it is an eye issue, or something completely unrelated.
And the itching was across one of those bands, around my torso on one side. And so he clued up onto that pretty quickly. And once he tried a few things and they didn't work, he actually gave a referral to a neurologist, which for me was quite surprising, because here I am with it. I thought I'd been bitten by a spider. And then I did start thinking maybe I had shingles or something like that. And as far as I knew, a neurologist was just your brain. And so I was thinking, hang on a second, like that seems like an odd referral. But I Googled the neurologist, and he was a specialist in MS. And so the penny dropped for me. I went and saw him. He ordered an MRI, as you'd expect. But again, I shouldn't assume that, because I've heard so many people where they're not offered an MRI for years of symptoms. So again, I was incredibly thankful that, within weeks I was getting an MRI. And while I had the MRI, and while I was waiting for those MRI results to go and see the neurologist, the symptoms shifted and changed, and it developed into more of what you'd call an MS hug. On one side, it was a constrictive feeling, and then I started very quickly to lose strength and sensation in my right leg. It just that the symptoms traveled down that leg, and initially they were a feeling of the leg being strange to me, or not my own, or feeling like I'm touching my leg through a glove. But then I started to get kind of foot drop and just clumsy, tripping over things and having a bit more trouble walking. And so I think in that period between when I had the MRI and when I went to see the neurologist for the results, I'd pretty much worked out what was going on. So the actual diagnosis itself wasn't too much of a shock by that stage.
And then how did you discover Overcoming MS?
So the neurologist, when I went to see him, and he kind of put the MRI up against that backlight and pointed out the two, what he called sizable lesions that were on my spinal cord, I said to him, is there anything that I can do? What should is there tablets I can take? Should I take some supplements? Should I be eating something or not eating something? And he just kind of laughed and said, oh no, just try not to think about it. Try to push it as far out of your mind. There's nothing you can do. Don't worry about it at all. And that is just so totally not my personality.
He wasn't offering you any disease-modifying therapy or anything?
Nothing. No drugs, no no, didn't mention vitamin D, didn't want my levels to be tested. It was really just like, come back if the symptoms, if you have another episode, if these symptoms don't resolve or if they get worse, but otherwise nothing you can be doing. And he wasn't even willing at that stage to say initially that it was MS, or that it could even be MS. And I really pushed him on that. And he said, look, if you had to push me now, I'd say it's probable MS. And so with that, I kind of went away and resigned myself to being in a wheelchair, basically, and started worrying about living in the houses that had stairs, and just kind of went into a bit of that spiral. And a number of people sent me through various links, and lots of different suggestions of try this, and this essential oils going to help, and all of that. And I got bombarded with it, and it was actually really quite frustrating because I was trying to deal with a life-changing diagnosis, and I wasn't really interested in kind of snake oil salesmen and having to put energy into that. And strangely, one of my dear friends, Jan, actually sent me a link to the OMS website and said, my friend's got breast cancer, but he's on this program, and I think you should have a look. It's actually designed for people with MS. And I went online incredibly skeptical. And I was I went on the website and I was thinking, what are they trying to charge me? And what's the catch? And what are they selling? And, I was really quite negative as I looked across the website. And then I, of course, read about George. And I saw that the entire program was spelt out there for free. I didn't have to pay a cent to be able to see all of the recommendations. I ended up buying the book, and it was posted out to me. And I've told George this many times, and we have a laugh. I actually read it in one sitting. It arrived. I started reading it. I read it all through the day. I read it at the dinner table. I went into the bath. I read it in the bathtub. And then I hopped into bed, and I kept reading until the early hours of the morning, and I finished the entire book. And when I woke up the next morning, I implemented the OMS program in my life straight away that next day. That was the difference between everything else that had been sent through to me until that. And I think, reading George's story, it's just so compelling. And, people often ask, what's the book that changed your life? And people often choose works of fiction, and I'm sure I could list off a couple of those. But if I'm very honest, it was that book, and it changed my life in the most profound ways possible. So I'll always be very thankful for that.
And when did you start seeing results from being on Overcoming MS?
So I'm not sure what the recommendation now is for the newly diagnosed. But back then you had to take fish oil supplements for 9 months, which was, before you could change to flaxseed. I'm not sure whether that's been revised.
It's now flaxseed, yeah.
It's flaxseed from the start. So the fish oil was that was a challenge, I have to say. But in terms of results, I recovered from that. I started OMS within 3 months of the initial onset of my symptoms, and I was recovered. I had a full recovery from my first episode, and that was at about 19 weeks. That episode kind of morphed. I had various other symptoms that came with that episode, but by 19 weeks that was resolved. And I am yet to have another relapse or episode since then. So that's been over 10 years now. What I did find, and when I got my conclusive diagnosis of MS, was a number of years ago, probably it would have been maybe I'd say 4 or 5 years after I had that episode and I'd started the OMS program, I had an MRI. I'd actually avoided having an MRI for many years. I just really didn't want to know what was going on. And then I changed neurologists, and they were quite insistent that I do have a checkup MRI. And that MRI showed 2 lesions in my brain, which weren't in that initial one. And because there'd been such a long time between that first scan and the second scan, there's no way to know when those lesions occurred in my brain. I believe that it happened before my body stabilized on OMS. There is a number of years that it takes for that to really kick in and for you to rebuild your systems. And so I think in those early years, I did actually acquire these 2 additional these 2 additional lesions. However, and we can discuss this later if you like, but my trajectory since then with lesion load and everything else has been so good. I think it did stabilize the disease for me, and I've not had clinically, I've not had any episodes of note since then.
And is that what keeps you on the OMS program?
That's a good question. I think that is certainly part of it. I think being well is certainly part of it. But I think the OMS program has brought so much more to me than the absence of decline. I actually think it's brought a lot of richness to me by way of just changing my outlook on my health and my well-being and putting that at the front and center of what I do. I am definitely a much healthier person now in a holistic sense than I was before my diagnosis. I love the way I eat. If you told me tomorrow that I can take a magic pill and you'll cure my MS, I will not be running straight to a cheese platter or to dig into a steak. I couldn't think of anything worse. So, I think what keeps me on there, I do have regular MRIs. The neurologist would love for them to be annually. I don't enjoy them that much, so I do them, every couple of years. My last MRI was last year, and the 2 lesions in my brain had completely disappeared. And one of the lesions on my spine is completely undetectable and not there, and the other lesion has shrunk to just 2 millimeters. And so to have that written in black and white in my MRI report, it just was a real validation. Like, I know I'm well. I don't really need an MRI to tell me that I'm well, but to just actually have it there in black and white from the doctors is, it is really encouraging.
It is just really, you know how you feel, but I don't know why you need a machine to validate what you feel, but it was just because mine they're sort of fading, because you can get undetected lesions as well where they don't actually have much effect on you just because of where they are, and then there's still activity. But knowing that there's not activity, then it gives you that positivity, doesn't it?
And I think for me that those appointments are stressful because I'm not opposed to going on disease-modifying treatments. I've been open to that from the very beginning if they're warranted and if they're needed. My understanding of what would warrant it might be different to my neurologist, but I am actually very open to that. But every time I have these MRIs, I basically dive in and do all of this deep dive research and have got all my notes prepared to have a really robust discussion with the neurologist about whether now's the time to, assuming there's going to be a more of a lesion load, is now the time to go on disease modifying treatment. So I kind of psych myself up for that. And the last few times, when I've sat down, they've gone, right, you've got a clear MRI, you're all fine, keep doing what you're doing. My neurologist isn't particularly isn't a big proponent of OMS, but doesn't discourage me from it. And I've always said that's all I need from a neurologist. I don't need them. I absolutely can advocate for myself, and I can be an advocate for the OMS program and understand that. I just don't need them to be antagonistic towards it. And my neurologist is certainly respectful that it's something that I want to do, whether or not she thinks there's merit to it. She's respectful of my decision, and that's pretty much all I could ask for from a neurologist, I think.
And your story's published in the first months after MS diagnosis chapter of the new Overcoming MS Handbook. So what was it like to work on the project for the handbook?
I have to say it was something that was just incredible. It was an incredible honor for me. As I said, the actual OMS book that George wrote has played such a pivotal part in my life. And I was asked and approached to write this chapter introduction at a time when I was celebrating my 10-year OMS anniversary. I celebrate my OMS anniversary every year. And so this was published around the exact same time as that milestone for me. And so it was really quite emotional for me because I think, when we're diagnosed, I think all of us put our minds towards the future. And I just remember reading at the time of my diagnosis what the risks and the rates were for, needing a cane at the 5-year mark, needing a cane at the 10-year mark, needing a wheelchair at a 10-year mark. And they were pretty terrifying statistics to have, in those first couple of weeks after diagnosis, and to actually be standing there 10 years afterwards, and to have, not only have this book exist and this program, and all the richness that comes from that, but to have my story included in that, in something that's had such a huge role in my life, was just phenomenal. It was an amazing experience, and just really, it really meant a lot that my story hopefully could impact others in those first dark days of their diagnosis, because I think we can certainly do better for that with people.
And you've got 2 young children, so how do you deal with family prevention for people with MS?
So, yeah, it's something I've taken really seriously from the start. I had my children after my MS diagnosis, and I felt, and everyone has to, this is parenting in general, everyone has to do parenting the way that it aligns with their conscience and their beliefs. And I felt, for me, having children who would have an increased genetic risk of developing a neurodegenerative disease, and we shouldn't overstate that risk. It isn't as high as some people think, but it does exist. For me, bringing children into an existence where they do have that elevated risk meant that I needed to do what I could to mitigate those risks from the start. And for me, it really was very much from the start. Before conception with both boys, I ensured that my vitamin D levels were excellent. I was and am incredibly compliant with the diet. When the children were conceived, I continued my vitamin D supplementation and my flaxseed oil supplementation throughout pregnancy. And of course, people need to, I'm not a healthcare professional, people need to talk to their doctors about this and make sure they're getting the right advice. But for me, I maintained that supplementation throughout both pregnancies and throughout breastfeeding as well. And I breastfed as long as I possibly could with both boys. We know from the data that does have some protective factors as well. And so I also supplemented the children when they were younger with vitamin D supplementation after they had finished breastfeeding. I live in a place in Australia that has a lot of sun. And we do have a really high skin cancer risk here. But I have walked that really fine line with the children with sunshine between the risk, I think, here in a place where it is so sunny and there is that real risk of skin cancer, is that you have them covered up all the time and you don't let them outside. I've tried to be a lot more pragmatic with their sun exposure and, ensure that they don't have sunscreen on. Children are covered in sunscreen in the morning before they go to school or before they go to childcare.
Yeah, no, that's what I found, because I've been to Australia quite a few times, and they swung wildly from one to the other, didn't they? It was like, when we went to Australia initially, and we've got friends out there, it was you put sun cream on and you let it soak in, and before you go out of the house.
So the risk is that children are getting no sun exposure intentionally to mitigate one risk, but then actually increasing their risk for something else. So I was just quite honest with their childcare providers early on that I wasn't putting on sunscreen in the morning, and that they were just to have sunscreen applied before they went out at the peak times of the day, because you absolutely should be doing sun protection again in the peak times. And so they would have their sunscreen applied after that early morning period before the mid part of the day. So just being conscious of that. Again, I'm not a doctor and people need to follow health advice. But for me, it was just making sure that the boys were getting some sun exposure and some vitamin D supplementation. In terms of diet, I made the decision early on that they would be dairy-free. From all of my reading about children and their development, I didn't see dairy as being an essential food group for children for their development. So they have been dairy-free their entire lives. They're now 9 and 7 years old. I understand there'll come a time when they might want to introduce dairy in their lives, and we've been talking more as they get older about why I made those decisions for their diets and their they're very understanding of that. But, that will be an evolving conversation with them as they turn into their own little humans with their own, beliefs about these things. But they have had meat through their lives. So they're not OMS compliant in that way, but they've definitely, not had dairy. So I think it's just balancing that, what the growing needs of children are, and what risk factors we can remove.
My daughter will only eat chicken breast in terms of meat, or chicken breast and fish, and so she's pretty much OMS plus chicken breast. My son will eat meat, but he still won't eat dairy. And you sort of saying about that family risk, and I know it is elevated, but I think you need to tell your children it's still low.
Absolutely. We shouldn't overstate it, and it shouldn't be something that we ourselves live in absolute fear of.
Almost certainly they're not going to get MS, but there is an increased chance. But I think my kids, especially because my father had it, I think they see that as like
intergenerational.
Dad, they're next. And I'm like, no, that isn't the case. By which you can reduce it by increasing vitamin D and getting rid of dairy and exercising and all these things. Then you can take it down to probably lower than typical population. And
that's the conversation I'm looking forward to having with them when they're a little bit older, because the OMS plus chicken, if I ended up with two boys who chose that as adults, I would be very, very happy. But I do have one child who is an absolute carnivore, so I'm not sure about the chances of that.
Yeah, my son is, he eats red meat still, but he's still mindful of, that, we're sort of saying, just try and make sure it's good meat at least.
Yes, exactly.
Like cheap sausages.
And look at the overall kind of saturated fat intake of your diet, because just for human health, you've got to keep an eye on that.
Yeah. So outside that, you recently hiked the Camino de Santiago with your family. So firstly, because this is global, what is it? And how did you manage it, and how was the experience?
Yeah, so the Camino de Santiago, well, there's many different routes, and they go through a range of different countries: France, Portugal, and Spain. And it's a traditional pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, which is on the west coast of Spain. And the route that we took was the French way, which in total is just under 800 kilometres. We didn't do the 800 kilometres. We did about 215 kilometres of that as a family, my partner and I, and the two boys, aged 7 and 9. I had my long service leave this year, so I've been with that same organisation that I was with through my diagnosis. I've now been with them for almost 13 years, so a little bit delayed with COVID and everything else, but was finally able to take the time off to do the walk. So, completed 215 kilometres of it
with two young children as well.
They were amazing. So. Some people who do the Camino, there's services where you can have your bag sent forward each day. So you hike each day to pick your location. It's all done on foot through little Spanish villages and towns, and it's a quite amazing countryside and farming land to kind of cross through, and vineyards. And some people send their backpacks. It's all done with your everything you need to carry on your back. And people have services that send the backpack to their next location for them. But I'm super proud that the Littlies actually carried all of their own equipment themselves for the whole journey. So they were little champions. And I think that the most amazing thing for me was watching the locals, especially like old Spanish women who were, sitting on chairs outside their homes. They would yell out to the boys in Spanish that they were champions or that they were strong, and they would applaud them. And the other pilgrims, we didn't run into hardly any other children the whole time that we did the hike, and so we were a little bit of an anomaly there. And so other pilgrims would have their photos taken with the boys, or just take photos of the children. Yeah, it was. Shopkeepers would give them lollies and treats and lollipops, and so it was just really amazing. It was an amazing experience to do as a family. And again, if you'd told me 10 plus years ago that I was going to even want, I think that's the point, I was even going to want to hike 215 kilometers, I wouldn't have believed you. But I think that's part of this change. I never played team sports before my MS diagnosis. I never had any level of fitness or any interest in any kind of fitness activity or outdoors activities. And so that's all come from this much healthier view on holistic health.
And you mentioned your job just then. So what is your work and how do you manage any work-related stress?
That's a very good question, Jeff. So I'm the Deputy CEO of the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, AIEF, and we provide boarding school scholarships for Aboriginal First Nations children in Australia. And I've been with that organisation, as I said, for almost 13 years. There's a lot of work to be done and a lot of high pressure situations. I think for me, the main thing has been recognizing what is stress and what is a stressful situation versus what is a high pressure situation, and really being clear in my own mind about, yes, the pressure's on. Yes, there's a lot to be done. There might be constricted timeframes. You might have constricted resources, but stress for me means how do you experience those situations? Because I'm always going to be in this kind of role. I'm always going to be in those types of situations, but how I choose to experience them is where the stress comes in. And if I find that if my stress levels are rising, and our bodies often have little signals to tell you that you are, no matter what you're telling yourself, you're actually physically stressed. Mine is that I often get a cold sore. And in the past, I haven't had this for a while, but my leg, my bad leg would go tingly, or I might have a strange patch that might go a little bit, my hand a couple of years ago went a bit numb and strange. And it's just these little signs that, okay, actually I'm experiencing this situation as a stressful situation. And for me, it's about unpacking that and just trying to understand that, yes, it's a high pressure situation that needs to be addressed and needs to be worked through, and trying to myself approach it more like a puzzle or a challenge or something intellectually engaging, rather than having and enabling and allowing that really physical response to the situation. I do a fair bit of public speaking, and that's my one top tip on that is, when you're sitting there and you feel a bit shaky and your legs go a little bit weak and your heart is racing, I do always tell myself, oh, wow, I'm really excited. And this adrenaline is and that's what it is. You're actually getting the physical adrenaline. And the thing about adrenaline is it actually helps us with our performance. And so I always think to myself, I had it just the other week. I did a presentation, and I have to admit, I did feel a little bit of that adrenaline coming through, and I thought, oh, that's great. I've got a little bit of that adrenaline. I think I'll need that up there. So that'll be a help. So I don't know. I just think I turned 40 this year, and I think just as you get a little bit older, you get to know these tricks and you get to know ways to make your brain work for you rather than against you. I think you just get better practiced at that. So that's absolutely, when it comes to stress, just really being mindful, being self-aware, listening to those cues, and then being really pragmatic about what is the source of that, what is causing me the stress. I said to my boss just recently, oftentimes stressful situations, stress situations that other people find very stressful, they don't tend to stress me out. I actually do genuinely see them as a challenge or a puzzle or a problem. What causes me stress is usually other people's stress responses. So when other people have got heightened stress levels and might not be performing at their best and might be, behaving a little bit differently, those kind of behaviors are stressful for me. But, even having that awareness is helpful.
So you also attended an OMS retreat in the Yarra Valley. So can you explain that experience? Or I know I've been to Yarra Valley, it's a lovely place, but could you explain what the retreat was like and how that was?
Yeah, it was amazing. So I think I'd been on the program for about a year when the opportunity came up to go to the Gawler Centre in the Yarra Valley. And that was when I met George for the first time, George Jelinek. And it was a really remarkable experience with some people who I am in touch with to this day. So that's, over 10 years ago now since I went there. I think for me, having been on the program for a year, a lot of the people who went hadn't started the program yet or were in the very early stages of it. It was kind of an entry into OMS. There were a couple who'd been on it longer than me. But for me, doing it at that 1 year mark was really helpful because it just solidified the behaviors. So where a couple of things had slipped or slide, it was a really good health check for me to bring them back in line to make sure I was being more OMS compliant. It also helped immensely with meditation, which is something that I, to this day, always struggle with. But it was a really good eye-opener, being forced to meditate, multiple times a day. There's nothing that kind of gets you over it, like over a hurdle, than just being actually given the time and space and opportunity to do it. That was really good. And as I say, there were just some amazing people. We have lost a couple of people from that group since then. A couple of really special people have passed on. And that even just to have known them through that and through the time since was and always will be really special.
And so you've been on the program for 10 years. So is there anything you still struggle with in the OMS program?
I think for me, I am always busy and I'm always running things down to the very last second or minute. And anyone in my life can attest that, if I've got a spare hour, I'll put an hour and a half worth of things into that hour. That's just how I live my life. I'm always running from one thing to the other. The other day, 2 days ago, I went to Canberra for work and I was up at 4 a.m. and I was on a plane at 5 a.m. And then I landed back in Brisbane at 6:30 p.m. and there was a board meeting starting at 6:30 p.m. So I went straight from the airport to the board meeting, and the board meeting finished at 10:15 at night. Now, there was literally no time in that day to meditate, but it is a cop out because I kind of use that busyness as an excuse for not having time. I am aware enough to know that there absolutely is time when you make time for these things. And when I have been really compliant with the meditation, the mindset that I've used. I've done smaller bite-sized pieces. And when I was really good with it, I was telling myself, you don't leave the house without brushing your teeth. So, that's built in. You would never do it. There's no scenario where you're so rushed for time, you don't brush your teeth. And so I was in a very good headspace that meditation was exactly like that. You just don't leave the house until you've done it. But I regularly fall off the bandwagon. So yes, that is the struggle.
I think you can live mindfully without meditation, and mindfulness. Absolutely. Not always the same thing. So you can actually have a mindful dog walk or a mindful.
And I found the Camino was amazing like that. I just had a phenomenal, just being able to walk, with the children, observing the light and the sounds and the smells and just being incredibly present. I would say that entire trip was pretty much meditative from the start to the finish. It was just a really present. I've never been quite so present. And it's mainly because I didn't have to work and I didn't have board meetings, and the children were with me and walking in the same direction as me always. But absolutely, so I definitely embrace mindfulness, and I do practice yoga and I do meditate, but it's just not part of my daily rituals, which I think I would be better off if it was.
And just as a final question, if you were to go back and talk to your newly diagnosed self, what piece of advice would you have?
I think I would just say, And in some way, I kind of knew this on the inside, but I think I would just say, you've got this. Like, I always kind of knew it. I always knew that I'd be all right, no matter what happened. But I think I'd reinforce that even stronger in me, that, I do come across often very confident, and, OMS has given me a lot of confidence, but I do even, within the last couple of years, I do have quite fearful moments. Something starts to tingle, or, you get a little bit of it, and they're probably just normal people things, right? I'm sure other people have tingly things at times. But if I know that I've had a bit of a stressful period and then I start getting some symptoms, I start thinking, oh, is this the beginning of it? Is this the beginning of the downhill descent? And so that fear still lives with me even now. It's always kind of somewhere in the background. I've got a lot more confidence as time's gone on, but I think I would just want the me that got diagnosed to understand that, you've got this, and, the next 10 years are going to be the best 10 years you've ever had in your life, with the most amazing experiences you've ever had in your life. And your MS diagnosis is central to that. It's not in spite of your MS diagnosis. You're actually going to be a better person because of it. You're going to be a healthier person because of it. You're going to have more insights, more empathy, more experience and understanding than you ever imagined because of that diagnosis. So don't begrudge the diagnosis, just really embrace it. And I think I did that, but I think, I'd just like to reassure that person a little bit more that it's going to be okay.
Okay, and with that, thank you very much for joining us, Renee Coffey.
Thank you, Jeff. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Living Well with MS. Please check out this episode's show notes at overcomingms.org/podcast. You'll find useful links and bonus information there. Have questions or ideas to share? Email us at podcast@overcomingms.org, or you can reach out to Jeff on Twitter @JeffAlex. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you next time for tips on living a full and happy life with MS. The Living Well with MS podcast is for private, non-commercial use and exists to educate and inspire our community of listeners. We do not offer medical advice. For medical advice, please contact your doctor or other licensed healthcare professional.